Now you should be hearing me well. All right. A very good morning to everyone. First, of course, on behalf of the World Intellectual Property Organization, I would like to sincerely congratulate the Ministry of Youth, Culture and Communication for, of course, organizing this excellent expo. And thank you also sincerely for inviting WIPO to join and speak. Second, congratulations to you, all the participants that are here in this room. You are here on a Saturday morning at 10 o'clock to speak about intellectual property rights. So already, congratulations that you are here in the room, and thank you for being attentive to this very important issue. So now, why I am here representing WIPO? Well, the video games are the reason why I got into intellectual property. Some 25 years ago in Poland, when I was playing my favorite online game at that time, someone hacked my account and stole all my virtual equipment. Some of you, I can see, are already laughing how important, how big of a tragedy that could be for someone who's been gathering that equipment for some time. And I did not decide to go that 25 years ago to the police station and tell them that someone stole my virtual sword, someone stole my virtual gold-plated armor. What I did is I decided to look at the EULA, the End-User License Agreement, and explore myself. And this is for the first time 25 years ago when I found out about intellectual property in video games. Here I am, 25 years later, working for WIPO, where I also coordinated a major international project for small game, especially small game developers, for them to understand. Now working in external relations in my organization. And finally, because of this work around video games, this is the time where I can sit down at home, play that video game, and when my wife comes and tells me, "What are you doing?" I can tell her, "This is for work." So, with all this in mind, in the next 30 minutes or so, I would like to, one, explain why video games at the end are in essence an amazing quest for intellectual property. Two, give you a few tips on what you can do with that IP. And three, show you where you can find out even more easy to use tips on intellectual property. I want to keep it practical and useful, so there will be no lectures. Maybe you were hoping for some, but there will be no lectures on legal provisions, historical dates, unless, of course, you want to start this way a Saturday morning. I have years of training speaking about paragraphs, provisions, but I know that some of you are also lawyers, but please forgive me if I will not go into the provisions themselves. I will keep it really very practical. All right. Let's start with a basic, which is IP is at the heart of each video game. And every video game, in the end, is a multiverse of intellectual property. They are packed with creativity and innovation, from the code of the software to the design of the characters, from the music and voice acting to branding and marketing, from storytelling and innovative gameplay to the hardware that shapes the gaming experience. All of this is protected and enabled by intellectual property, ranging from copyrights, trademarks, patents, or designs, or even trade secrets. Just look at this next slide. Basically, almost every component of a video game can be protected by various intellectual property rights. The two most commonly used ones will be copyright and trademarks. Copyright, maybe you know, is everywhere. It protects anything original from the software to any of the audio-visual elements of the video game. The text, the audio, the cinematics, the characters, and even sometimes the whole entire world, the universe created by the video game. And the good news is, the cool news is that copyright doesn't require any formality. So you automatically get protection the moment something is created. And there's no payment, and no filing is required in order to receive that protection on copyright. The second big one is trademarks, which protect the brands. And this is not limited just to the name of the company or the name of the video game. This sign could be anything that is distinctive within the video game itself. So it can be the character, it can be a weapon, it can be a sound. All of it can be protected by trademarks. But of course, the bad news here is that this is not automatic, and you need to file for registration and pay fees in order to receive that trademark protection. Here, let me perhaps also add that on patents, which are exclusive rights to inventions, and also they require an application, and are not, but the good news is also that they're not just limited to hardware only. The mechanical aspect of the video game could also be covered, as it can also protect invention of software, and to some extent, of course, with differences across countries and regions, the game mechanics themselves. Besides copyrights, trademarks, and patents, you will also have various other IP rights, such as designs, trade secrets, or even image rights. In some cases, you will also have assets that can be protected by 2 or more different IP rights. So for example, a distinctive symbol, an originally looking symbol, can be protected by both copyright, but also you can register it as a trademark. So there's a double potential protection for different assets of the game. So looking at this list, looking at all the things I said, this is actually quite a lot to comprehend very quickly. And now, for that final blow, that moment every game developer is looking forward to hearing, intellectual property law is territorial, which means that all these different rights to all these different assets are protected separately by laws of each country. So while there is some harmonization taking place around the world, international harmonization, and by the way, a lot of that is happening in WIPO, in my organization, but each trademark, each patent, each copyrighted work will be protected according to each country's laws, which have their differences. They're not the same across the world. So taking into account that games, in essence, are often global in nature, and I'm looking around the room, this is how some of you might be by now reacting with all this information that you are hearing. And it's also not a surprise. Many video games, game developers often see intellectual property as something very difficult and legalistic. And what they end up usually doing is they contact a lawyer when time comes, which is great for us lawyers gathered in this room. I'm a lawyer myself. But the problem is, very often they contact that lawyer too late. So basically, at this point, I can say, game over, right? I finished my presentation. I have nothing more to say besides contact the lawyer as soon as possible. And let's open up for a Q&A. Well, not necessarily. There are things, a few things a game developer can do right now, today, which do not require a legalistic knowledge. You have a few things you can do right now. And these are actually things that are not difficult, and they are quite straightforward. If you do them, you will cover and avoid most of the biggest mistakes we can see as lawyers and in general in the industry from an IPR perspective. So how can you level up your IP right now, today? In WIPO, over the past 1.5 years, we came up with a new project for video game developers, where together with some of the best IP experts, we developed different tools to help them understand and navigate intellectual property in an easy and understandable way. I will go into the project a bit later, but let me focus here on the substance, on what are those basic IP issues a game developer needs to know about IP itself. We divided this into 5 different levels, mostly following the different stages of game development. So you have level 1, IP during concept phase, level 2, IP during development phase, launch phase, IP level 4, IP when speaking with the investors, and level 5, we focused on IP and sports. So let's just go through these 5 different stages and give you some few tips that you can try to perhaps integrate into the work as a game developer in order to better protect your IP. Let's start with the concept phase, where nothing has been created yet. And this is often the cool time. This is the creative part, where you might be sitting down with a few friends and with through a coffee-infused night, come up with the next biggest game out there. And already at that moment, it's good advice to start thinking about IP. For example, a game developer shouldn't really start working on a game without some clarity on agreements in play and agreements in place between the members of the team. These agreements could already clarify the ownership of the IP created by every member independently, as well as in collaboration, and it could also make sure that the IP is owned by the company. Take here an example of the designer, the main designer of the character inside the game, who leaves the company before the game is launched. And no agreement was signed with that game designer, which would mean there's no IP that might have been transferred to the company itself. Let's try to imagine how difficult it would be to chase down that game designer who left the company in not good terms and ask him to transfer his or her IP rights back to the company. It would be a pretty difficult negotiating situation. So it is important to monitor this creative process with all team members as soon as there are ideas about the game. Write it down, just write it down, and keep track of what and who is participating in this process, and do the relevant paperwork that shows the evolution of this process. And be careful also when in tracking whether there are using or recalibrating works and from where they are taking them. This is also a time where very many game developers will decide, will they create their own IP, or will they start using third-party intellectual property rights? In the case of the second, start thinking on licensing agreements that will permit you to use third-party IPs. Some of them, of course, because of their size and how big they are, they might not be achievable, so it's a good time to start thinking about it right now. Also, don't forget to check if the license of the core software that you will be using for developing the game itself, what is that license? Is it open source? What does it say? Will you have to release the full source code of the game on the same license? These are good questions to ask during concept phase. Next is the development phase, and this is what we like to call the IP bonanza time, because this is where many, many things are being created for the game itself. Most actually will be protected automatically by copyright, so that is the good news. But throughout this whole process of developing the game, this entire time you need to avoid the infringing of other people's IPs, and at the same time, making the strongest IP protection for what you have created. The best way to approach it is to have that systematic review of the IP created and IP use. Again, just keep track of it. A simple Excel table on your desktop is going to be enough as a starting point. Just put that Excel table up, make sure that you are putting in there who is creating what, and did you clear the relevant IPs in order to use this in your game? It's not rocket science at the end of the day. You already, by the way, started doing that during the concept phase, right? So you just continuing doing it during the development phase. So because everyone in the team should also be on board and should also track that intellectual property, it's also good common sense practice to train the company staff on some of the basics of IP and what they have to remember and understand about it. By the way, this is also a good time if you're doing something really, really very different and innovative. You can also potentially, at this point, talk to a patent attorney who will determine whether there is scope for patent application. And as much as I don't like saying across the board, go contact a lawyer, when it comes to patent applications and applying for a patent, this is the part where it is worth actually checking in with a patent lawyer. Often, also at this phase, some aspects, of course, of the game will be evolving, and it might not be advisable to register your IP rights, such as trademarks, at this point, because things can change, and of course, if you want to register a trademark, you have to apply for it, register it, and pay the fees. But at this point, it does make common sense to do a knockout search. So just use a search engine, or the Waipu Madrid system, which is an online free-to-use database, where you can see all the trademarks that have been registered across different countries. And see if that key name or symbol in your game is not used by anyone. If it is, it could be more easily rethinked at this stage than later on. Level 3 is about just before the big day, the final launch of the game, and what to remember here. Well, run a compliance review in order to be sure that you have all the IP licenses you need and you registered all the IP you think you need. There are some good questions you can ask yourself at this point. So, do you have the proper license for all the software used in the creation of the video game? Did you use any open source software? Did you check their license? Did you sign IP-inclusive agreements with those who participated in the creative process, either in-house, but also outsourced? Do you use any IP from third parties inside your video game? And did you obtain the relevant rights to use those? And also, did you use any real persons or real architecture from the real world inside your video game? If you did, it's good to check if you're allowed to do it, because this I'll come back to later. This is also a good time to decide whether or not to invest in protection via, for example, trademarks and designs. Let's focus on the trademarks, because those will be one of your key components of the promotion marketing of your video game. And it's here, as a small, especially game developer, it's good to be strategic about it, because a game developer doesn't want and doesn't have the resources to register a trademark across the world for all potential ideas of symbols they might have inside the game. So you have to be strategic about it. So for example, you don't want to pay for a trademark registration and later find out that that term is largely used already in a different context, or even worse, that it is offensive in some of the countries where you will want to distribute your game. Good questions also to ask here at this stage is which countries you want to distribute your game, and in which countries are your main competitors. This will determine the IP laws in which you will focus most, both for compliance and for protection. Since you have a limited budget, beyond the name of the company, the title of the game, what else do you want to register, and are they actually registerable? Again, going back, it can be a symbol, it can be also even a sound. Again, here, this is the part where many things will not be very straightforward, but at the end of the day, you have to think about intellectual property, not only from a legal perspective, but from a business perspective. This is a business tool that you will continuously use as a game developer. This will be the way how you will be able to monetize that innovation and creativity that you are doing. Now, moving on to level 4, this is the time where you are sitting down but you could have been doing that even earlier, of course. But this is about speaking with the investors, of course, also potential publishers. And for investors, for investor meetings, IP will be crucial at the end of the day. It will be important for them. They might not directly sometimes ask those questions about intellectual property itself, but that doesn't mean that they won't want to know about it. And IP is, at the end of the day, of course, together with you as the managers, developers, the amazing creators and innovators, the IP is the thing that they are going to be investing in. So make sure you have that in order. And there are cases, and I've heard of cases, of course, where if the IP was not in order, investors walked because there was something which wasn't clear on that intellectual property perspective in the files of the company. So it's good to check every relevant aspect of the game and make sure that the IP was documented, ownerships, and that the ownership to the company is applied, and the relevant licenses have been cleared with third parties. It's good to double check on the due diligence and be ready to show that the company has in place an IP review system that you have been using for some time already. And this is the systematic review of IP that the company owns and uses, and this helps to assess and manage the risks, and also, of course, find remedies in case that there are problems. It is much better to do it as soon as possible because it's not worth to lose the time and money later on. And everything at the beginning, it's good to start tracking everything from that beginning. So, like I said, in the concept phase, you already did that Excel table, you started already putting information there, and making sure that you have cleared all those rights that you are using in the video game. This is a good moment where this also kicks in and is very important to support you in your talks with investors and publishers. So, as an example, where I've heard from other cases is on open source use of open source software, where a company found online a free piece of code, which was on an open source license, and they used that in the game. Only later, once the game was basically finished, it's the launch day, they checked in with a lawyer, and they found out that in order to comply with that specific license, they have to make the entire game open source, which is not the strategy that they were thinking of using in order to launch the game itself. And this has happened countless of times from what I've understand from colleagues who are lawyers and supporting video game developers. One thing here to also maybe add is, of course, I know it's a basic information, but again, I've heard stories about this from the industry. When you sign contracts with investors, publishers, please, as small game developers, go through that contract, read the contract, focus also on the provisions related to intellectual property, and in case of that you don't understand, because sometimes it could be admittedly a complex language, which is more understandable for lawyers. If you don't know it, what it means, do get in touch with that lawyer. I've heard stories of small game developers basically handing over all their intellectual property currently and for future iterations of video games themselves. So it is important to read that contract. Another good common sense advice is to, if there's room for this, of course, when speaking with investors and publishers, is to add a clause on arbitration and mediation. Because especially, so arbitration mediation is a more informal way of trying to resolve disputes, but in some cases they have the same power as court decisions, with some, of course, additional provisions. But it is good practice to include ADR clauses in the contracts, because if you are a small developer and signing a contract with a big investor, imagine how much time, effort, and money it will take in case of a dispute that you would have to go into court internationally, for example, in different countries than where you are operating. This sometimes can be a very heavy burden, especially for small game developers. So it's worth adding that clause on ADRs, because through that, in a much more quicker, easier way, you can resolve those disputes. Now, when it comes to IP and esports, I won't go into the details here during my presentation. We don't have that much time. But just to mention that intellectual property is the crucial difference between sports and esports. And if you have an esports video game in mind, that you want to create a video game in esports area, it is important, even more important, to understand and apply intellectual property, because through intellectual property and the relevant licensing surrounding it, you will be able to control the entire ecosystem surrounding your video game. Let me perhaps now, going through these different levels, let me just very briefly touch upon some of the more cross-cutting issues and mention those which might be especially also interesting. The first one is, of course, the major rise of cross-media expansion. Think the TV show The Last of Us or the movie Super Mario. Think comic books, video game characters and stories, or video game music albums, or even mentioned yesterday, video game-inspired board games. Also, here you have merchandising in itself is a major revenue stream for game developers once they have a successful game. By the way, whenever you enter my apartment or my office in Geneva, you will know how important merchandising is for gamers themselves. Perhaps I see some nodding here in the room. This is definitely something that someone who's passionate about gaming will invest also a lot in, and this comes back to your company. One thing to mention about all these issues is that all of them are extremely IP intensive. So from copyright of the look of that main character of your game to the trademark of the game, without taking care of your IP rights, if your game becomes successful, you will not be able to fully monetize your amazing creativity and innovation. So remember that especially in case that if you become successful, IP will be the way how you'll be monetizing a lot of the different many cross-media expansion revenue streams. We touched upon this a bit earlier, but it's worth underlining. Video games, due to their digital nature, can easily have a global market. At the same time, as I said, intellectual property itself is territorial, and only the biggest players will have the possibility to protect their IP globally in all countries where they are distributing and where they are marketing their game. This is both from the side of registration fees, but also on enforcement. So enforcement means trying to enforce your rights to your intellectual property. So if someone is infringing your IP rights, you have different ways how you can make sure that they stop, and then, of course, pay you back potentially for that infringement. So while the good news is, of course, that copyright does not require any fees for registration, so the moment it is created, the moment you have your rights to that work, but of course, small developers especially have to be very strategic when it comes to the IPs that need registration, and this mostly would be trademark registration. So you have to make those decisions on where do you want to register your trademark. There are some common sense things that many developers have been taking into account. So for instance, the common favorite registration countries, regions for trademark registrations are, of course, the big markets, but as well as the countries where potentially infringements could be more likely for your specific video game itself. Now, something cool to mention here is that our experts who were working on the study on copyright infringement in the video game industry, there's a whole study you can download, of course, from our webpage. But one of the elements of that study is that they created a heat map of the most common infringements in the video game industry and how dangerous they are for the game developer, but also how difficult it is to enforce those rights. So for example, for cloning, the potential negative impact on your video game will be high, but the likelihood of success of copyright litigation would be rather low. So there are these things that it's good to take into account whenever you will be looking into chasing someone for IP infringement. All right, this is the point where I'm reaching like more like a moment where if there are any pending burning, but very burning questions to what I've said before, I'm going to go over a few other things such as AI and so forth, but if there's any questions you have at this point to ask, please, you'll get the microphone.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you for being here and for giving us this, all of these precious informations. I'd like to know, I'll give you an example. It will be more clear. Like, I've seen in some Russian games, I don't know if you know that game, like CarX Technologies Studio. They, and we've seen this type of thing over and over, you know. They use the specific cars that's without license, but they don't add a logo. Is there any risk for infringement in such practice, for example, for making the video games? And some of these cars are tuned with the body kits, you know, these type of things, you know. And the cars are pretty much similar, you know, the same geometries and everything, but they only don't have the logo. That's the thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a very good question. And of course, here there's many depending pieces. Of course, I always have to add to this, and it also very much depends on different regions, countries, and their specificities. But in general, the design of the car itself can absolutely be protected by copyright. So how, let's say, the look of a Mercedes has, the lines of that car and its look, it is protected by copyright. So of course, in case that someone would directly use the look of that car in their video game, there is potential for IP infringement. Even more, of course, if there would be a logo on the car itself. But there have been cases across the world where I think there was a case in the US regarding the Humvee car. In one of the, I think it was one of the, either Call of Duty, perhaps it was one of the Call of Duties, which used a similar version to the Humvee itself. And if I recall correctly, the court decided that in this specific case, it was not used in a way that could infringe the rights of the Humvee owner. But these are very specific cases once they go to the courts. But in general, as a general thought, if you use the look of a very specific look of a car inside your video game, there is potential for IP infringements. Please.
Thank you. So I'll give you a quick anecdote that, and then kind of follow up with a question. Years ago, I used to work for NCSoft and art-directed the Guild Wars series. And at one point, we had just, we were about to ship Guild Wars 2 in China, and we went there for a big industry event, the biggest there is. I'll leave it unnamed. And in the States, we had the Art of Guild Wars 2 book in the process of being printed. Everything was, you know, already in the hand of the printer, but the book wasn't out there. As soon as we arrived there, fans came over with a book printed, impeccably translated in Chinese. Even the, you know, the paper stock was identical to the specs that we had, you know, provided for the American version. And, you know, we were blown away. How did that happen? We don't know. My question is are these, you know, instances of clear, you know, pirating worth pursuing, or is it a lost cause to begin with?
Thank you very much for the question. Now, I won't be able to advise you directly saying if when it is, in your specific case, we're of course going for IP infringement, and of course that would require going to the courts and trying to prove, of course, that specific IP infringement, which does take time and money to do. One thing I would maybe advise in these kind of cases is have a look at that heat map and potentially have a look at the study where really high-profile, really good experts explored how likely it is and how expensive it might be to pursue IP infringements in different cases. And it will be varying across the world, of course, across different countries and their legislative system. There are always also, in some cases, exceptions and limitations to copyright. But in this case, of course, I would highly recommend just having a look at that study. If there might be some advice also in these kind of specific cases, what you might be doing. All right, we will have time for more questions at the end. So let me maybe continue on with my presentation because I might cover some of those issues you might be asking about. So let's go back to the presentation because I think it went down. And sorry to the team, to the technical team for doing all these kind of changes and so on. Thank you for the understanding. All right. So thank you again for the questions. And then let's move on here to some of those really burning issues that very often are coming up within the video game industry itself. AI, on artificial intelligence. Be aware of the risks. Can an artificial intelligence use infringe the rights of others? There is a certain risk, and it is now up to the courts across the world who are deciding on specific cases to reply to that question. Safest solution, what I've heard from different lawyers' advisors, was use AI, which was trained on cleared IP and data, ones which you can for sure use in order to generate new creative works. The second part question is, can the content generated by artificial intelligence be protected by copyright? So when you ask an AI to create the design of your character, can you receive protection of that character? Now, AI outputs might not have such protection, and there's a risk that in case that you would create the design of a car or the look of a character through an AI, you might run a risk that someone might use that exact same design without any legal remedies for you as the creator, the one who used the AI to do it. Now, some common sense advice I've heard was to not especially use artificial intelligence generated AI, work generated by AI for the main components of your game. So for example, if you have the main character of the game itself, it's good that it could be good that it's created by you directly, because in general, it's important to always remember that in general, again, because there might be some exceptions across the world, copyright is granted only to humans. So only a human being is able to receive copyright protection itself. Open source, I'm coming back to this quite often, but this is because we've seen this so many times, we've heard stories about this so many times. Read the license of what you are using for the development of the game, and choose the right tools and those relevant licenses which are compatible with your business model. Some open source software licenses are only for non-commercial use, or might need the release of the full source code of the derivative work. So if you use a piece of that open source software inside your game, you might need then to release the whole game on that kind of the same exact license. And there are examples of more copyleft licenses, such as, for example, GNU GPL 2.0 or 3.0, or more permissive licenses, such as MIT license or Apache licensing. On Easter eggs, well, check. The good advice is check with the IP owner or be creative with the references. Easter eggs usually do involve some level of appropriation from another copyrighted protected work, and it depends, of course, on the amount and substantiality of the portion taken from that original work, but there is a risk of copyright, especially copyright infringement, potentially even trademark infringement. So it is, you will be also surprised very often how, of course, other game developers are happy to give you the possibility to make some direct references through Easter eggs to their games. It's an amazing community and, of course, very supportive. But from an IP lawyer's perspective, it is good common sense to check first with the relevant IP owner. When it comes to real-life brands, of course, referring a bit to these questions, be aware of potential, of course, infringements. This is about copyright protection and trademark protection. If they are similar enough, there is potential infringement of those rights of the third party who has created it and who owns it. So, of course, it's good to secure the license from the big brands, but of course, obviously, as a small game developer, you might not have that opportunity to do it yet. So there is, of course, a way to potentially explore parodies as a way of trying to integrate similarities to real life inside your game. There are, of course, big companies who also have been doing that and have amazing, by the way, trailers that have been released recently. But check about the parody option and potentially in your countries if you are insisting on trying to make it as similar to real life brands or companies inside your game. Now, real life buildings, you have to examine the legal situation in each specific country. It differentiates across the globe very much. Buildings, architecture, murals, branding can all be protected by intellectual property. So do that case-by-case checking, and maybe there could be a freedom of panorama existing in a specific country, which could allow you to integrate the real-life buildings inside the video game itself. But also, of course, some buildings might already be in the public domain, so a certain level time has passed so that you can use it inside. But that doesn't always mean that you can immediately use it inside of the game, because there are other laws that can come in. For example, protecting the cultural heritage of a country. So it is important to go by case-by-case way. And also remember that one thing is copyright, so for the look of the buildings, of the streets of specific cities, but the other thing is the trademark. So for example, if you have a very well-known building with a logo of Mercedes, and let's say the public domain, it's already, the building itself is in the public domain, so there is potential that you can use it in your game, but you still have to check other laws. But the logo itself, that's a very different story, because that might not expire in general, and of course is protected by trademarks. Now, on the public domain, remember one thing to remember here is that one thing is copyright, the other is trademarks. So some of you might have heard that potentially, I believe that Mickey Mouse himself went into the public domain recently. So there is potential possibility to use Mickey Mouse inside your video games in that version of where it went into the public domain, but it doesn't mean that you can use the name Mickey Mouse inside your video game, because that name Mickey Mouse could be protected by a trademark. So these are the things that you need to take into account, again, on a case-by-case basis. So always, of course, when speaking about IP, time is short. So let me just say a few things on where you can further level up your intellectual property. And that's quite easy at this point, just to say, visit our webpage, wipo.int level up. And it's a dedicated webpage for game developers to understand in an easy, accessible way intellectual property. It includes free checklists. Again, because we are a United Nations specialized agency, and for us it's important to do the development work and support amazing creators and innovators across the world. Everything that we have provided on this webpage, of course, is free of charge, and many other materials as well. So there on this webpage, you will find those free checklists that you can just put up on your wall. Remember about those basic things when it comes to intellectual property when you're developing the game. They're also issued in a free way, meaning you are free to translate them and repost them, do whatever you want with them. The materials are there to help you. We also have podcasts with amazing companies, experts from companies such as Konami, CD Projekt Red, Tencent, but also successful small studios who are showing their story of how intellectual property helped them in their journey. But from the big companies, you will get like really direct advice on in a business-oriented way on how you can protect your IP when you're developing the game itself. And also just to say that during each podcast episode, you will have a 5-minute segment which recaps the lessons learned from what those business people from the gaming companies have said. So there are like really very tips-oriented approach for everything. What you will also find on the webpage is a link to our LinkedIn community. So we have a group of almost already at this point 1,000 members. The great thing is representing basically almost all the biggest companies I could try to recall are there on this group. And there on the group, we're sharing, of course, the stories from the industry. We're informing about different events, activities that we are taking, that we are organizing across the world. And we're generally trying to build this kind of community that is supportive for game developers to understand how they can benefit from the intellectual property itself. We also have lots and lots of materials that you can use as a game developer or in general as a creator or innovator in order to make sure that you can benefit from the IP ecosystem. One example I can give is the first one, Mastering the Game publication, and we've just updated this very recently. And this is 400 pages. I know not all of you will go through 400 pages of IP and business issues, but it's 400 pages of everything you can imagine when it comes to the IP and business of video games. So whenever you have still some questions when using our checklists, you can always go to this publication, which is, again, all of it is free of charge, available. You can download it and check specific issues that you are in detail on what you can do with your IP itself. Worth mentioning, perhaps, is also a cool thing that was prepared, a case study of Cyberpunk 2077, where it was analyzed all the different IPs that went into making the video game itself and how they come about and how they are protected. So by using a very specific example and a game which is very rich in IP, you will see how important it was and how important it is in the video game itself. So all these materials, again, are available from the web page. For the end, let me also mention one more publication. Sorry, I'm doing this, that word, publications, but you're always just free to follow up on those which are the most interesting. But this is a publication which was approximately 3 weeks ago we launched it, and it was, by the way, presented by my colleagues during Digital Dragons taking place in Krakow very recently. And this is a publication which covers very extensively also the video game industry, and it takes a closer look on how video game development hubs are being created across the world by using examples of US and Japan, but also Finland or Poland. So how come these gaming hubs have been created and what were the conditions that allowed them to do that? And at the end of this publication, we also have a chapter in that chapter for the video game industry, a set of recommendations for policymakers on how they can create better conditions for such hubs to grow. Now, one of the findings of that report was the massive growth of trademark applications registrations for gaming. This, of course, speaks for the growth of the industry over the past many years, but this also means that gaming companies are more aware of the importance of trademarks and, in general, IP. One interesting finding from this table is also that when you register a trademark, you need to decide in which classes it goes into, so which industries, what areas you want to use that trademark in. Very interestingly, the trademarks in the past years, companies are more registering it across different industries. So this cross-media expansion is 100% in a way confirmed also through the way how companies are registering their trademarks. Now, let me finish my presentation because I'm sure we probably already ran past the time, but I also want to have some time for any questions. Let me finish by saying one thing. Now, how many of you know how much you have on your bank accounts? Probably most of you know and are following very well how much you have on that bank account. Now, how many of you know how much intellectual property you actually have as a company, as an individual? Interestingly, that IP can be worth 10 times, 100 times, 1 million times more than what you have in that bank account. So please, please, to make sure that you can benefit from your amazing creativity and innovation, track, protect, and manage your intellectual property. And with all that, thank you very much for your attention. Shukran. And this is the time. I don't know how much we have still the time. We don't. But I'm looking at the organizers, 5 minutes they are showing me, so if there's any still questions to ask. I know you were the first one from the previous round, but then the second question here.
Thank you very much. My first, let's try and be brief. My first question relates to the consumer. Does consumer attitudes and knowledge about intellectual property affect how we register our trademarks and copyrights? Because, for example, I would say a large portion of Moroccans, dare I say most Moroccans, don't really put much value on intellectual property because it's nothing really concrete and it's not really palpable. It's not an asset to them. And let's be honest, who would pay in Morocco $60 for a AAA game, for example? That's just way too much when you can get it for free, for example, or through unconventional means, let's say. And that also leads to the next question, which is, can certain IP be overvalued, if I were to use that expression, or overpriced even? How would you say?
Okay. Thank you very much. These are very good questions, of course. So one thing I will start with saying first is that as a game developer, I always admire any game developer, either small or big, because so much work has to go into developing a game. IP, the IP system itself, is there to help those creators, innovators, monetize their intellectual property. That, as a general, let's put that as a general frame. Now, of course, IP in a way is valued also based on consumption, meaning how popular it is, how valuable it is to bring in new consumers, new players to the game. So this is something, there's no 1+1 valuation system. And actually, if you ask a lot of experts in the World Intellectual Property Organization, if there's one way to value your intellectual property, there is not one way that is foolproof. There are many ways how you can value intellectual property. One way will show you very different results than the other way. So valuing IP is a very difficult business, but there are, of course, companies and there are people who are doing it. Again, it's about how popular the brand is and how many consumers, how many players will start playing because of that IP of the game. So I wanted to have a slide on user-generated content because I think that you have touched upon through your question on that. So on user-generated content, of course, a player can also be a creator at the same time. And when playing a game, when developing things in different gaming ecosystems, then they could also be ones getting IP protection. But again, of course, that's why I also read that license of that online game those 25 years ago. There are provisions in the relevant licenses which basically say that whatever's created within that ecosystem is then, of course, very often owned by the company. But again, it depends on the companies, and they are having very different approaches. But as the creator of those video games, they do have that right to decide what is the potential leeway and what is happening. But of course, I also am aware that there are cases across the world where user-generated content has even gone to courts because game players have designed such amazing worlds inside virtual spaces that they can also potentially also have a lot of IP protection and draw in new players to the game because of that specific world that was created. I won't name the name, but this is something which I can't give you a direct reply, but each case-by-case basis. Now, I think now, yes.
Okay. No, it does. Okay. First off, thank you so much for the presentation. And my question is, so laws differ from country to country, where something is okay in one country and it's not in another country. And let's say you're a victim of copyright infringement, but the same law doesn't work in the other country. Do you go ahead and bother dealing with that copyright infringement, even if, for example, your country is not equipped with the tool to deal with it?
Good question. Of course, I will refer a bit to that heat map again, which I mentioned to the previous question as well, where we do provide some insights about these things, about telling you what are your chances of going for IP infringement cases. Now, as I mentioned, that IP is territorial, but at the same time, of course, I also mentioned that there is a certain level of harmonization across the world, and there are majority, very, very big majority of countries across the world who are members of the TRIPS agreement, members of the Berne and the Paris Conventions, which make some basic IP laws across the world. So if you are a signature of that treaty, you have to apply these regulations inside your country. As a general rule, copyright is quite protected across the world, and any IP infringement on using someone else's work inside your work will very often constitute an IP infringement, with exceptions and limitations aside. Now, it has to be on a case-by-case basis, and of course it will depend on the very many countries across the world. But have a look at the study which I mentioned, and it will give you some preliminary advice on what are your chances. One thing is to also mention, but here it's more not on direct infringements by those who are abusing your rights, but more on with partners. ADRs is another great option because it's irrelevant. Most of the countries also across the world are abiding to a treaty that makes ADR ruling as important almost as court rulings. And it's a much more easier way to achieve outcomes of an IP dispute. So this is also something that I mentioned during the meetings with the investors. It's good to try to see if there's a way to include such provisions in your contracts. I'm seeing this, which probably means we have another 10 minutes. All right, thank you very much. And again, I have to thank you for being here on a Saturday morning to listen to intellectual property rights. Thank you for the amazing questions, and see you around on the corridors. We can follow up. I'm happy to after the presentation.